All right, we are back with the Lineup Podcast. I am Dave Prodan. I'm here with my part-time co-host for this season, Mitch Salazar, although feels a bit more like part-time this year as you featured in more than half of this season's episodes so far. More Mitch the better, in my opinion. In any event, a lot has been happening. We wrapped CT4, the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, won by Tour sophomore Caity Simmers and 2024 rookie Cole Houshmand. We're going to dig into that. Lost Surfboards and Matt Biolis, the defending CT Shaper of the Year, have regained the lead on the 2024 Vizsla CT Shaper rankings. We are approaching CT5, the Western Australian Margaret River Pro. The cut, relegation, after which the CT men's and women's fields will be sharpened by 1/3 heading into the back half of the season. We are gearing up for the 2024 Challenger Series season, where an international field of up-and-comers will answer the question of who is next as they vie for a spot on the 2025 WSL Championship Tour. And Mitch, you personally, you're coming off of a weekend where you were on the commentary tools at the QS 3000 Jack Surfboards Pro at Huntington Beach. So that's a great place to start. Thank you for that work over the weekend because it really helps for the podcast. But you had a firsthand look at who is going to be competing on the upcoming Challenger Series season, which starts next month. What'd you think? Who looked good?
Oh, it's just amazing to be able to work different levels of, both the CT, the challengers, and even the regional QSs too, Dave. Just really fortunate to be able to be in this position and to inform a lot of people on up-and-coming surfers, not only throughout my region, but throughout the entire world. Really impressed Alan Cleland. He's made the semis at that event 2 years in a row. He just qualified for the Challenger Series based off of last season. Nat Young looked great. Kalohe Andino, he got the injury wild card for the Challengers. He's going to be competing at Snapper in Sydney to start the year. On the women's side, Leilani McGonigal, Kira Pinkerton took out the event. Zoe Benedetto, Luca Messina's back-to-back wins. He won in Barbados a few weeks ago, took out his first major win in Huntington this weekend at the Jacks Pro. But just based off of internationally, on the women's side, really excited to see Erin Brooks compete and really give her, a full shot at qualifying this year. She finished number 9, so remember 6 to 10, on the Women's Challenger Series rankings from last year are able to get an automatic spot onto the Challenger Series for this year. Vagina Fierro from France, she's going to be competing as well. I like her odds of qualifying. She's been really close. Nadia Dostarbe, pointing out, Dave, she only competed in 4 events last year, and she was really close to qualifying for the Championship Tour, the Basque Surfer. You have Bronte McCauley right there. We're going to have Kika Vaselko, Ellie Harrison, who did great as a wild card at Bells. And on the men's side, I'm really excited to see the young crop of surfers. We saw what George Pitar could do on the Challengers last year. Did super well at Bells. You have Alistair Reginato, Joel Vaughn, who I think is a future CT surfer myself. Jackson Bunch, runner-up to the World Junior title. You got Jet Schilling in there too. And, of course, can't forget about the Brazilians. You have Mateo Serdi, Michael Rodriguez, Jackson Baker in there, Marco Mignot, who was also a few heats away from qualifying last year. I think the Challengers, to me, Dave, is a huge platform not only to qualify, obviously, but most importantly, just get your name out there. You can have one really good event like Nolan Raposa had last year in Bolito as a wild card. Next thing you know, really close to qualifying, getting wild cards through the rest of the season. So really exciting to see what's going to happen over there at Snapper Rocks in Sydney to start off the season on the CS.
Absolutely. And as you said, the Jack Surfboards Pro at Huntington Beach, it's a third tier, right? It's a regional qualifying series. They move up to the Challenger Series, all with the intention of making it to the show, the elite level, the Dream Tour, the Championship Tour. We're coming off of CT4, the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, and now it's time for winners and losers. So Mitch, who is your first loser from Bells Beach this season?
Yeah, unfortunately, it has to go to India Robinson. I know what it's like to compete at home, and I know what it's like to lose at home, too. And just a lot of pressure on her shoulders. She's number 16 in the rankings right now, Dave. She was really needing a result there. Competed in the back end of day number 1, few heats to finish the day, and she was really competing in difficult conditions and struggled just to find a backup score. Was in the ER, competed in the first heat of day 2 at Winky Pop. I was never able to really get things going over there. So back of the line really for her, number 16. But in her defense, she did win the Challenger Series last year. I feel like she's going to be relegated there. Won at Snapper Rock, so potentially going to see her on the Challengers. But wishing you the best over there in West Oz. And I think, if she has a chance of winning the whole event, there is a possibility of her requalifying through the CT just with that one big result, Dave.
It's a good one. And as we talked about, like this sport is all about leveling up. You can level up from the QS to the CS, the
Hmm.
CS to the CT. Maybe you don't make the relegation the first or second or third time, but you come back down. Maybe in even the very best surfers, even the world champs who we hold at kind of the highest platform of the sport, they're constantly evolving and getting better. So it's a great point about India. She won the CS last year. Didn't go well for her at Bells. Hopefully it goes better in WA, but it's not the end of the world if she doesn't requalify. She ends up on the CS
Yep.
and she'll continue to evolve. Similar conversation for mine, I think. The stakes of the season and where we're at in the calendar being what they are. My first loser coming out of Bells is the collective of surfers who are hovering around that cut line. Now, let's be clear. I'm not calling them losers as individuals or even the collective based on their ability or character or performances, etc. What I am saying is that psychologically speaking, if you're coming out of Bells in proximity to the dreaded 23rd or 11th
Yep.
spots on the men's and women's rankings, respectively, then you're really feeling the heat in Margaret River. You got Cade Matson, Seth Moniz, the Pupo brothers, and even surfers like Ian Gentile, Ramsey Bukiem, and three-time world champion Gabriel Medina, who are just above the cut line.
Yep.
A lot of nerves. And then on the women's side, you've got Lakey Peterson and Sawyer Lindblad and Isabella Nichols and others who have some ground to make up. I'd imagine it's going to be really nerve-wracking, but at the same time, as we've seen the last few seasons, the performance levels continue to elevate when there are stakes on the lines at any points of the season. And for the last few years in Margaret River, we've seen some incredible performances. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and just to touch on your point right there, I mean, if you look at the people, especially on the men's side, that are just below the cut line, there's really only a few rookies, and most of the surfers that are below the cut line are actually veterans. Seth Moniz, Sam and Miguel, Jake Wilcox is a rookie, but I mean, he's heading home to Margaret River and could easily have his best event of the season. Fred Moraes right there. Caio Belli, who has been a great surfer every single stop of the first 5 events that we have on the calendar, but not this year, though. He's had major struggles to make it out of the round of 32 and really needing a big result here in WA to make it past that cut line. Eli Hanneman, he hasn't been able to make it out of that round of 32 either. David Silva. Do want to point out, Kelly looked way better than I thought over at Bells. And, I just think he was a victim of bad luck in that heat against Bear Mamiya. Wasn't really able to get a backup score afterwards. But, it's just tough. You only have 5 events. They're really, really difficult venues to compete at the first 5 ones, too. And then you go into Margaret River where really it's a few people that are dominant over there. You look at John John's resume. De Souza's one there. Jack Robinson beat John John in a really tight final a few years ago. That's going to be a tough venue for a lot of these rookies. But I do feel like Jacob Wilcox has something to prove at home. Watch out for him. And now getting into my second loser here, Dave, it's really shorter boards at the Bells Bowl. I personally feel like if you look at the 2 winners, Cole Houshmand, Caitlin Simmers, they were riding larger boards on a day that wasn't necessarily huge out there at the Bells Bowl, but it just accentuated and kind of prolonged their surfing a bit more on those longer walls. I truly feel like you want to be riding something that you're usually going to be seeing out at Sunset Beach and at WA a lot more here at the Bells Bowl, where in comparison at Winky, look at the board that Sam was riding that had huge performances on his behalf in order to get his best result of the season. A carbon vacuum board by JS Industries that looked incredible in shorter waves. Smaller waves, though, where it's more high-performance surfing at the Bells Bowl, still wanting a little bit more of length. And Dave, I feel like that's kind of going to be the recipe for success leading forward, especially with the victories of both Cole and Caitlin here.
I love that take. For my second loser from the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, I'm going to go with Easter. And for fans that are unaware, the Bells Beach CT event is the longest running surf event on the planet, starting all the way back in 1962, well before Rip Curl and also well before the IPS, ASP, WSL Championship Tour came along.
Yeah.
Originally, it was billed as the Easter Classic. And, that tradition definitely has its merits for both surfers and surf fans in Australia. It's an awesome holiday. It's an awesome gathering of the tribe. But the pain in the ass about Easter, and I am tempted to quote the great Eddie Izzard's take on Easter originally being a pagan holiday before the Christians took it, but we'll abstain from that. But the pain in the ass about Easter is that it moves dates every year. And while we know that swell cycles are hardly follow kind of black and white rules, Bells Beach traditionally has better surf later in their autumn, coming out of summer. So when Easter falls later in the calendar year, like in late April, we generally see better surf through the competition window. When it falls earlier in the calendar, like it did this year, we sometimes struggle. Now, opening day this year was awesome conditions. It's some of the most rippable Bells Beach I think I've ever seen.
Yep.
But then it became pretty challenging after that. The world's best surfers were impressive, as they always are. But yeah, Easter takes the second loss for me coming out of Bells Beach.
It's a good take. I mean, you want it to be colder there. You're seeing a lot of people wear spring suits and short sleeves. That doesn't necessarily mean that those late swells have come through during that period of the year. And unfortunately for us, yeah, as you were saying, first of all, conditions were really hard, but most importantly, the swell consistency wasn't necessarily there either. And despite us having 3 great events to start the season before Bells, this wasn't necessarily the one that stood out so far out of the first 4 events of the year. It's a good pick, Dave. And my last loser has to be the top of the pack on the women's side. You have Betty Lou Sakura Johnson, who's coming off of the best trio event she's had to start off her season. And then Molly Picklum, who was leading the rankings even after an early round loss over in Portugal. Now Caitlin Simmer's the leader, and Johanne Defay very close in second place. So you don't want to lose that positioning in the top 2 spots if you're either Betty Lou or Molly. And as of right now, they've dropped down a little bit. I really like Johanne Defay's odds to win the event at Margaret River, too. She's been on a roll, 2 finals consecutive for her. And Caitlin Simmers recovered after a couple early X's at both Sunset Beach and Portugal, Dave. So now Betty Lou and Molly, they have a lot to pick up from here.
Same brain. I had both Molly and Betty Lou as well as my final loser coming out of Bells. I really don't have much more to add. They both had incredible starts to the season, and Bells seemed like an opportunity for them to consolidate those positions heading into WA.
Yeah.
That didn't happen, so we'll see if that was a blip on their season or something more severe over the next few events. I love what you said about Betty Lou having good performances in WA. I think over the course of my career here, I've noticed the Hawaiians typically do really, really well in WA. Was that your take as well, Mitch? And if so, why do you think that is?
For sure. Heavy waves, open water, and most importantly, you're usually surfing with longer boards at main break too. But say the event does get changed to the box, which I'm kind of crossing my fingers for at least a day or two. But that's another heavy wave where a lot of these people have experience at these slabs or heavy reef breaks, including Sakura. She's putting in a lot of time outside of the jersey right there, and I think I could even say the same for Molly Picklum. But watch out, Imai Kalani DeVault, Eli Hanneman should have a great event over there in WA, especially if we're running out the box. Can't forget about the best out there to ever do it, John Florence. And of course, on the women's side, big props to Gabriella Bryan. She made it into finals day over there at Bells. She also has a big chance to get her first CT victory in Western Australia, where she's been a runner-up before, Dave. Should be a real fun event, but as you said, Hawaiians usually are very dominant there. Getting into our winners now, Johanne Defay has to be my first back-to-back finals, as I said before, but most importantly, just keeping consistency where she tends to be a slower starter than most in the first few events of the season. That's not the case this year, Dave. Up to number 2 in the world. And remember, outside of last year, due to injuries in the first few events of the season, there hasn't been a year outside of 2023 where she hadn't finished in the top 10. This is her 11th year on tour now. We're talking about one of the most consistent surfers on the planet, and she had made the finals in 2 different occasions in 21 and 22. This could easily be the best year for the European surfer, and could have been the first European Bells title we had there over Easter weekend at the Bells Bowl.
I'm so glad you brought Johanne up, because actually one of our listeners reached out on our Instagram page at the Lineup Pod and asked the question. I responded to them this morning about why is Johanne Defay not really considered a world title threat by the broader surfing industrial complex, and I thought it was a great take, and I responded. She said the same thing. She's been on tour for 11 years. Almost immediately, she stood out to me as someone who had very few weaknesses. She was strong, stylish, really good on her forehand, fantastic on her backhand, and especially backhand tubes like Fiji and Tahiti. And really, the only reason I could come up with is she comes from a non-traditional geographic location for
Yes.
women's world title threats, right? She's from Reunion Island. She didn't have the same kind of hype. She didn't have the same kind of marketing sponsorship early on in her career, where that kind of sat in everyone's brains, from fans to sponsors to media, as, oh yeah, we need to watch her. But I think she has all the tools. I think she's surfing better than she has in her entire career on the CT. And I think she's 100% a threat. Is there any other reason that you would kind of point out that maybe people don't consider Johanne a world title threat?
Well, it's a good reason you bring up Reunion Island, because if you look at Jeremy Flores, he's from the same place. But what Jeremy did differently than Johanne, he had a sponsorship opportunity, with Quicksilver, where at a young age, he traveled outside of Reunion enough to be able to maintain a location in Australia and in mainland France, to be able to gain more exposure and eventually just have to relocate to one of those two places for the majority of the year, where Johanne didn't really have that until her late teens, way into her junior career, and by then she had already qualified for the championship tour. So you hadn't had that major exposure before you qualified. Jeremy had, and I think it's an excellent point you bring up, because geographically does represent France, but is from a French territory, though. And you see that a lot with a lot of Caribbean surfers, too. Charlie Martin, he was originally from the French Caribbean. Joan Duroux's partner as well, Maud Lecar. And you look at Joan's success as well. He's coming from mainland France, and he qualified for the championship tour with a lot of exposure before, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have success once you make it there. So I like the odds of Johanne Defay at least making the finals, but I truly agree. She's a world championship contender and could easily be the first female European champion we've seen in a long time, Dave.
One more quick point on that. Little known fact, because he doesn't like to talk about it without being asked. But Jeremy Flores, who put in one of the most heroic CT career performances of any surfer I've ever experienced. Everything was incredible. He actually sponsored Johanne out of his own pocket for a few years back when she didn't have mainstream sponsorship support like she does now. So awesome guy in and out of the water, Jeremy Flores. Bit of a tangent, but my first winner from the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, and this has been a bit of a theme this year since we are experiencing one of the more generational shifts at the elite level of competition in recent memory. But winner number one for me is the youth. We obviously have Caity and Cole as the victors of the event, but on the men's side, Jake Marshall, quarterfinals finish, and now fourth in the world. Crosby Colapinto, very impressive. Rio Waida, semifinals finish and vaults up 10 places on the CT rankings. Matthew McGillivray, semifinals finish and now well underneath the cut line, or above, whichever way we're looking, safe, heading into Margaret River. And then on the women's side, you had Caroline Marks and Brisa Hennessy, both in the semifinals. And Lineup Podcast, unofficial team rider Gabby Bryan with a quarterfinals finish and moving into the safe zone of the cut line, heading into the final event. The opportunities were there, and a number of next generation talent took them at Bells, which I think is a really nice contrast when you see the youths performing at the longest running event on the planet.
100%, and one of the most difficult venues, I'd have to say, on the championship tour, and just outside of that, on the planet as well. But, I have a similar second winner, and that's actually the Californians. Caitlin Simmers, Cole Houshmand, the two champions. You also have Griffin Colapinto, who is still leading the rankings, by the way. But want to give major props to Jake Marshall. We talked about it in our group chat quite a bit. He is looking fantastic this year, and I'm really excited to see him in the top 10, really getting the spotlight that he deserves right now. I feel like Western Australia should also be a good event for him. He did suffer, being a victim of the cut last season. That won't be the case this year. So major props to Jake. He's already done one better than last season. We'll have a chance to compete in Fiji at the end of the year, too. Could easily make it into the top 10 to finish off the year, too. Cade Matson gets his best result in a big moment against John Florence, too, where John had the highest score of the heat. Unfortunately for John, the ocean just went quiet after that, and Cade had a couple of scores underneath his belt. Want to say big thank you and congratulations to what Sawyer Lindblad has been able to do for the young rookies on tour as well. Remember, there aren't many of them. Only Alyssa Spencer and Sawyer Lindblad, really the two Californians that have made it on tour for the last several years on the women's side. And I feel like Sawyer has an amazing chance to do well in Margaret River and make the cut before that event finishes. And do want to give big props to Cole Houshmand, too, for his victory. After that one heat against Gabe, he just went on a roll. And look at who he had to defeat. to make it into the final, and then he beat the number one in the rankings afterwards. And one of the few goofy footers who's been a champ at Bells Beach, Cole Houshmand, doing good things at stop number 4, gets his first win as a rookie too.
It's interesting. Like, I think both our points are pretty similar, right? All the Californians you mentioned are on the younger side as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there are venues on tour that historically have favored experience in veterans, right? Whether it's Pipeline or Jeffreys Bay. And Bells Beach is maybe the one where over the decades it is, you might be young and fresh and have like amazing potential and amazing ability, but if you haven't put the time in out at Bells, it's going to gobble you up compared to the people who have. That doesn't seem to be the case as much anymore. It feels like these younger surfers are so much more prepared. Cole had a last minute clutch wave against Gabe Medina. Cade had his against John. Like these are now becoming kind of the feature instead of the bug with these younger surfers, where in the past, more often than not, these younger surfers would have melted down. Have you noticed that too, or am I making things up?
No, it's a pattern, but it has to happen though, because if you're a lower seeded surfer, the only way you're making it is by having to defeat the people that are at the top of the pack. You see that in tennis, you see that in basketball with seeding in the playoffs too, you see that in baseball as well, and I think in surfing, it being such a subjective sport, as we saw at this event, all that controversy surrounding the one heat between Cole and Gabe, you need to leave that out of your mind. So you can't take that into your next heat. And I felt like Cole was so decisive with his victory. He said, hey, I'm comfortable with the way I'm competing. If I can do it against a 3-time world champion, I can do it against anybody else. And he beat his mentor, one of his best friends in the final. To leave that aside too, Dave, is a major thing that he had to overcome, and he ended up getting his first victory. And as a rookie at Bells, there have been very few people that have been able to win a bell as a goofy footer, and none have been able to do it as both a goofy and as a rookie in the same year.
It's pretty cool. Well, my second winner is a theme today, but this is maybe an unlikely one, but I'm going to go with Bells wildcard George Pitar as my second winner from Bells. Now, to be clear, George did finish equal 17th, losing to Ethan Ewing in the round of 32. That said, I thought George was surfing so well in all of his heats. And for sure, there was an online dust up about whether, Ethan Ewing, the defending event winner and one of the best Bells Beach surfers of all time, got the score that he needed on the final wave of his match with George's. Everyone's respective echo chamber may vary, right? But it seems like it was kind of split 50-50 in my personal one. And George, to his credit, when he was asked about this on broadcast the following day, and he was gracious and funny and humble, and saying that when he came in, his phone had blown up over it. And then he watched the heat back on the analyzer and he was like, look, I thought Ethan got the score, before praising Ethan as really the standard out there that he looks up to. So really classy from George. And in addition to his surfing, I think that endeared him to a lot of people, and even more so to myself, because I was already a fan, having first noticed George at the 2023 Challenger Series event at Snapper Rocks. And I actually messaged my good friend and now very worthy CEO of Rip Curl, Brooke Ferris, about this. I'm like, wow, this kid's really good. Where'd he come from? And, fast forward a year, he's surfing even better. It seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders, which is what we were just kind of talking about. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how George goes in the Challenger Series event.
So am I. I mean, he did great last year in his rookie year too. And actually looking at his results, he did finish within the top 20, number 19. Got a 5th at the U.S. Open, which ended up being his best result. So he automatically requalified for the Challenger Series just by being within the top 20. Major props to Pitar. I'm a huge fan of his style. I think it's the thing that really stands out the most. But he's just kind of sparky. Always finishes his turns with a little extra sauce. And I think he's going to have a great start over there at Snapper Rocks. And it's a good pick. I think to clarify to our listeners, our winners and our losers don't necessarily always have to be people that end up in last place or end up winning the comp. Like, it can just
It'd be a boring
anybody.
podcast if that's the case. Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, it's something that you've already seen on the broadcast, so we're always going to try to mix it up here. And my final winner, Dave, you mentioned them briefly before, but it's the dark horses on finals day. And Matt McGillivray, he had to overcome his good friend Morgan Siblick and earlier rounds. I thought he surfed great, made it into the semis, which is his best result to the date. And as of right now, sitting number 14, he is way above the cut line, pretty much guaranteed to requalify for the rest of the year. Same thing to Rio Waida, number 11 on the rankings now, coming off of back-to-back good appearances both in Portugal and in Bells. Gets a semifinal finish, which at the moment is his best result today too. Number 11 in the rankings and the first Indonesian to qualify for the Championship Tour, which is just absurd by even saying it out loud again. But the market that it opens for Asia, having both Kanoa and Rio Waida on the Championship Tour, need to get a CT back in Asia once again. It needs to be in Indo or Japan, I feel. But having these two guys on the Championship Tour is huge for us, and I feel really opens up the possibility to get more surfers from that region engaged in both the World Surf League and in terms of qualifying eventually for the Championship Tour as well.
Great pick. And well, just before that, we mentioned that our winners and losers are not always correlated to their performances and their results at these events. Sometimes they're more subjective. Oftentimes they're more subjective. Sometimes they do relate. And my final winner, we've mentioned it a couple times, but it's Cole Houshmand. And yes, he won Bells Beach, but my God, the San Clemente power broker, we had him on the lineup just before the season started. And you and I, we both had pretty big calls in terms of his CT level expectations this season on the strength of his strengths. And despite looking good in free surfs, and frankly, he looked pretty good in his heats too, the results didn't come his way. And He was well outside the cut line at 26th heading into Bells Beach. Dead last in his opening round heat. He survives, barely, a nasty elimination round heat. And then he bests three-time world champion Gabriel Medina in the round of 32, Kanoa Igarashi, Ethan Ewing, Matthew McGillivray, and Griffin Colapinto to ring the bell as a rookie, vault up 18 positions. I don't think that's happened before at this point in the season. 18 positions on the CT rankings, and it was incredible. He is a huge winner from Bells, both inside and outside of the water, so congrats to him.
Well, and you brought up a major point, too. He looked good in free surfs. He had a couple waves in competition that looked great. Came off of a good result in Portugal in 9th place, which at that point had been his best result, but lost to Crosby in a heat where he looked like he should have been winning. Crosby eventually made it into the semifinals, and now the tables flipped. In this event here, he had to take out the who's who of professional surfing. Three-time world champ Medina, as you said, Kanoa, who had been a number one in the world heading into this event a few years ago, too. Ethan Ewing, defending champion, Matt McGillivray, who hadn't lost a single heat, and then his good friend, mentor, and leader of the rankings, Griffin, in the final. I don't think there's been a single event where rookies had to go through a murderer's row of people in order to win his first CT championship, and at a venue where few goofy footers have won, and especially in the last few years having Wilco and Italo win. This is a major feather in his cap when you're looking at some of the greatest goofy foots to ever do it, including Gawky in the late 90s to win there at Bells Beach.
Yeah, the only way it would have been harder is this was like the Hunger Games and the villains were like, just kidding, now you got to surf against Mick. Just kidding, now you got to surf against Aki. Like, it was a crazy, crazy field he had to mow down. So congrats to all of our winners coming from the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach. We're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. All right, we are back. This is the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan here with Mitch Salazar, and now it is time for the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings update.
Shaper Ranking!
Background for our listeners, in case they're unaware, Shapers are given points based off the performances of surfers riding their boards that finish in the quarterfinals or better. It is a combined rankings, men's and women's. The higher the surfer places, the more points that Shaper receives. We'll be tracking the Vissla CT Shaper rankings from Event 1 through Event 9 this season and crown a winner before the WSL Finals in September. So, when the dust had settled on the Vissla CT Shaper rankings post Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, it was defending CT Shaper of the Year Matt Biolist and the Lost Surfboards program retaking the number one position. They had a record-setting 6 results out of a possible 16 at Bells Beach, including both men's finalists in Griffin Colapinto and event winner Cole Houshmand. Really, really impressive. That said, Sharp Eye Surfboards collected 5 results of their own,
Yep.
including women's runner-up Johanne Defay, who is currently, as you mentioned, second in the world following back-to-back finals. Early in the season, of course, but Lost and Sharp Eye, they are creating the contours of a 2-horse race at the moment. Mitch, what stood out to you on the 2024 Vissla CT Shaper rankings from the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach?
Well, first of all, I didn't know it was record-setting until you said it right there. That's crazy that they got 6 people into the quarters or better, both men and women combined. I think it comes down to having a really good women's team, and I feel like Gabriella Bryan, Caroline Marks, they are huge for Mayhem right now. If they're able to get Suri Lindblad into a bit more of a role here, especially heading into Margaret River and get her into the quarters or better, that's going to be major for them. Not a huge amount of separation between Sharp Eye in second and Lost in the lead, just over 3,000 points. But then you look at second and third, just over 41,000 points separating Sharp Eye and Channel Islands. That's massive right there. So CI, they definitely have a lot more work to do. Baron Mamiya hasn't really been able to get any good results after the event at Pipeline. But then you look at DHD also bowing out kind of early where most of their surfers. You need Connor earlier to step up. You need Ethan to start winning. I know it's hard to win events, but at least make the semifinals. Luckily for them, he did make it into finals day over there. But what I will say is that one thing that really stands out to me is that we're seeing somebody like Caitlin Simmer still opt to surf with Chris Borst Designs, and he's already had 2 wins this year. Not going to be catapulting himself into the top 5 conversation just by only having one surfer. But I think this is something that we're probably going to see with Caitlin in the future. We see it with Gabe. We're seeing it with Simmers right now. I just think there's such a personal relationship. And given the conversations that we had during the offseason, Dave, about somebody signing Caitlin, somebody's on the verge of signing Betty Lou Sakura Johnson. It seems like it's either going to be Paizel or Channel Islands. But as of right now, I just feel like Caitlin's so comfortable with Chris and their personal, intimate relationship, knowing that that's been going on for more than a decade now, and she's still only 18 years old. So I don't really see that changing right now. It just seems to be like there's too much success. And on the men's side, same thing's going to happen for Gabe and Johnny Cabianca. I don't see that relationship dipping out at any point, and I just feel like it's going to continue to grow and maybe even start happening a little bit more on the championship tour. I wouldn't be surprised to see certain surfers opt to select a local shaper and not a big brand.
Super interesting, and you mentioned DHD, Darren Hanley's one of the world's best surfboard shapers, has so many world titles to his name from the likes of Mick Fanning, Stephanie Gilmore. I thought we were going to see a bit more juice from DHD at Bells, and I'm sure he did too, right? They have a very strong team. I think this was an opportunity for them to make up a bit of ground on home soil. I'm sure they're thinking the same thing in WA. It's really interesting, right? And some of these programs in 2024 have certainly been dealt some blows, right? You look at like the Sharp Eye men's program is doing the season without Felipe Toledo. Like if Felipe's on tour, it could be a very different story, right? DHD, 8-time world champion Stephanie Gilmore, she's taking a year off. She'll be back in 2025. Awesome Bell surfer. That's another one that they would use to sort of buoy the roster.
Yep.
But then you look at a program like Lost Surfboards, Carissa Moore stepping away indefinitely from competitive surfing. She was a huge performer and earner for that program.
Yep.
They're number 1 in the world, right? And so it's interesting when you look at these programs and how they were able to successfully backfill, or if they're having bad luck, or if they're putting all their eggs in one particular generational basket. It's interesting to see them deal with attrition on their teams.
I think Bells is a particular wave too, where certain people always kind of rise to the occasion. We saw Courtney Conlog with Stamps, succeed there 3 different times in different kinds of conditions. When it was medium, when it was huge, and then you had to surf over at Winky Pop on smaller days and adjust your equipment. And I feel like that's kind of what helped out Caitlin Simmers, is that she was prepared to ride a longer board at the Bells Bowl. She had her normal shortboard quiver to ride at Winky Pop, and there were a couple heats where those in-between kind of days over at the Bells Bowl, you're thinking to yourself, should I ride something longer, get into my waves easier, and just draw out my turns a little bit longer, or I do want to surf in the pocket a little bit more and make things a little bit more high performance and explosive. And when you look at it, this is a really difficult venue to adjust in terms of your equipment, not just because of your boards, but because of your fins too. Richie Levitt did a board breakdown that I thought was super interesting, talking about the Mick Fanning fins, where Mick had been a former champion there on multiple different occasions, and that fin's kind of really suitable for the wave. I mean, you look at it, larger template, bigger outline, and something that really wants an open face wave, which is what we saw at the Bell's Bowl. Now you go over to Winky Pop, I need tighter transitions, shorter turns, but most importantly, making sure that when I get to the lip, there is some release. So that's where you usually want to wear a fin that's more accentuated, like Felipe's one that FCS makes really well. You usually want to surf something like a Black Sticks model, or maybe even the new carbon core fins that Future has. And those are things where you look at Cade, you look at Cole, all these guys who bring different sets of fins, different sets of boards to be able to adapt to these conditions, exemplify on their rookie season on the championship tour, which is really, really hard to do. I mean, you look at people who have been on the Challenger Series for years, on the qualifying series in different venues, and now traveling with at least 2 board bags, I'd say, into Australia. This is a venue where you really need to capitalize on the few opportunities that you do have, Dave.
Absolutely. You mentioned that just now, and that was one of your points in the prior segment too, but can you expand a little bit more just on the surfers riding longer boards at Bells? You know, what is the advantage? Like, is this a new trend that we've seen in recent years? Obviously, it was the case, a few decades ago. And do you anticipate that the longer board the longer board trend is going to, it's a phenomenon, is going to continue at Margaret River?
Well, it is kind of crazy to think about it, though, because Kelly changed the game for better or for worse, I would say. Remember 2008, it was, he brought out that shorter board, I think it was a 510 at Pipe, ended up winning the event over Chris Ward, who was riding at least something, a foot bigger than that. I personally feel like it's the right decision to do. You're standing out, and you're doing something different. And really, that's the whole thing that you need to do in a competitive sport where it's usually one-on-one heats, right? In order to be able to be a little bit different or have a little different sense of emphasis on certain maneuvers, to me personally, not only do you get into waves earlier, but most importantly, you're drawing different lines. So especially for a goofy footer over at Margaret River, we've seen Ryan Callanan bring out some bigger boards. He's had a near perfect ride over there. I think that's going to continue to be a trend unless it's truly small at main break, or unless we're seeing something at the box where you just need to be under the lip to make the drop. So to me personally, I think at certain venues, Tahiti, maybe at the box, it's not necessary. Even at Fiji on the smaller days, you could easily get away with just riding a short board. The Bells, Sunset, Margaret River, I would say even Cloudbreak and restaurants when it's bigger, you need to be riding a bigger board in order to be successful out there.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that I bring up pretty regularly on the podcast. So I wouldn't say every episode, but maybe every other. But, that idea that you bring up around creating a point of difference in your surfing, whether that's an approach or a physicality or even an equipment in certain venues, right? Like you brought up the Kelly on the Deep Six in 2008, shorter, stubbier, wide point forward board for surfing a wave like Pipeline. And I think that we've seen surfers use quads. I think hollow waves and slabbier waves like that, the point is, how deep can I take off? How deep can I stuff myself in the barrel? How do I maximize the critical components of that? And for sure, I think there'll always be design tinkering and approach tinkering and how you do it. But it's I won't say it's one dimensional, but that is the one thing that you're doing on that wave, right? Is maximizing the critical components of the ride. At waves like a Bell's Beach, where there is more of a canvas, or lower trestles where there is more of a canvas, it is interesting that we haven't seen an even more radical experimentation with board design from the world's best surfers, right? And I could appreciate it in a beach break. It's like, hey, I'm looking to maximize the vertical approach in my surfing. I need a thruster, I need a Ferrari board, etc. But if you're trying to stand out, or even Surf Ranch, another good example of this, right, where the canvas is pretty consistent, it's pretty rare that we see surfers use radically different equipment. I mean, Dan Reynolds used the original dumpster diver in the finals against Mick Fanning. I think it was around 2010. He also used the underrated and unheralded, really, but the Merrick Twin Fin Altered, the MTFA, against Roy Powers in round 3 at Seignos in France one year, which I
Yeah.
felt was a transformative experience. We mentioned Kelly, but we don't really see like fishes or 2+1s or really, actually, no, I'll back up. We have seen even Felipe Toledo, obviously, right? His carbon-based quad out lowers to win a world title,
Yep.
but it's pretty rare. And do you see that changing from the world's best surfers moving forward? Would we see someone take out like a 2+1 performance fish anywhere in the future and not do it to relax themselves and not do it as a bit, but to go, no, I feel like I have a legitimate competitive advantage using this equipment?
I don't see why not. I mean, personally, I don't think anybody should be opposed to that kind of idea. I don't think you should have a closed mindset, especially if you're a professional athlete, to be able to do that in a competitive sense, because once again, it just brings up a point of difference. And it's a subjective sport where somebody's just always looking for something a little bit different for you to stand out in order to make sure that you're actually beating this person based off of the criteria that they're judging you off. They don't necessarily have a criteria based on the equipment that you can ride. As long as it's a shortboard, you're going to be able to ride it in this contest. It's not like it's a longboarding event where it has to be a certain weight, a certain length, has to weigh a certain amount either. You can ride anything you want here. And actually, it's a good point that you bring up with Dane Reynolds and the twin fin over there. I remember that he clearly, because he had a sick backside air that was more of a straight air, and Roy Powers just had no answer for that. I mean, his scores weren't breaking the fives. Dane had a 9 and an 8, I think, and he had him comboed in like the first 10 minutes. Now, you go into the final against Mick. What was the big point of difference right there? Mick riding a little bit of a normal board, high performance, and Dane just didn't have an answer with his dumpster diver at that point, even if it was a little bit smaller. So they were appreciating Mick surfing more on the equipment that he was riding rather than what Dane saw. Now, the point that you bring about the barrels, I think, is a perfect case of quad setups or different fin setups and not necessarily the length, because depth is what you're looking for. And especially with a shorter board, if your nose isn't being seen and it's a couple inches shorter, that's actually beneficial to you as well. So the less the board is seen, it means the deeper you are. And I think you're usually going to see that at venues like the Box. I think Tahiti, you're going to see it a lot more. And especially with a guy like John Florence, who tends to not ride very large boards at Pipeline either, even when it's huge, you're going to see it a lot with him. So, I think these trends of larger boards at performance waves like Margaret's, like Sunset, and like Bell's should continue, but not necessarily at barreling waves or even waves that'll necessarily just be slabbier ones, like even Tahiti. You don't necessarily need something long to get into the wave. You just need to be under the lip.
It makes sense. Another thing we should mention from the Pro Bells Beach is TNC Surf, helmed by Glenn Pang. They're number 5 in the world on the Vissla CT Shaper rankings. And on the strength of Brisa Hennessy's incredible season so far, but they are the lead Hawaii-based shaper on the rankings right now. And 3 years ago, if we had to guess who was going to be in the mix, they probably wouldn't have come up as our first choice. I think it's really impressive what they've done. They also have Sally Fitzgibbons on the program. They had a lot of non-team riders, but riding their equipment, at Pipe and Sunset Beach as well. And it does feel like there's a lot of juice in that program at the moment. What do you think about that?
I think it's a great pick. I mean, you look at Mayhem leading the Vissla CT Shaper rankings. They have 3 men in the top 10, and they have 2 women in the top 10, Caroline and then Gabby, sitting right on the cut line right there. But once again, small shapers, they're just having to compete with teams that have much larger size, and most importantly, people that are succeeding at the very top too. You look at Sharp Eye, they've always had a very dominant team, especially with Felipe the last few years, as you were mentioning. On the men's side, Jake Marshall, a standout surfer this year. He's in the top 10. But I think Town and Country, Glenn Pang, especially with the success that he has over there in the Hawaiian Islands, he's not necessarily preoccupied about his success on the Championship Tour outside of having the 2 women that are Brisa and Sally right now, because most of his orders come specifically for waves like Oahu, like Maui, like Hawaii, because that's where his boards are being used. Now, he does have to put a good amount of attention on the 2 surfers that he has on the Championship Tour for obvious reasons, but it's not like he's needing the publicity because most of his customers and his clientele are based out of where he's from. So as of right now, I think he's just very proud of getting the publicity that he's getting through the Vizsla CT Shaper rankings. And I think the pressure's just on the bigger brands. You mentioned Darren Hanley. They need Liam O'Brien to be able to step up a little bit more. Connor O'Leary had a down event. On the women's side, Isabella Nichols, she's a former champion in Margaret River. She needs to do well at the last event before the cut line, too, in order to get more points. And I want to call out Jason Stevenson, too. I think he's had an incredible offseason. He got both Pupo brothers. Really stoked for Sam and Miguel. They haven't had good results to start the season, though. Ramsey's made the quarters. Ryan Callanan off to another solid start to the season. They need to get more finals day appearances, too.
It's a great point. We're heading to Margaret River, right? And Main Break is the primary venue. We mentioned the box as the secondary venue. Even Main Break has a number of different faces. And to the civilians' eyes, like mine, pretty radically different kind of waves, right? You know, Main Break on its day versus the box on its day. Mitch, do you need two radically different types of surfboards to compete at each venue? And do you think the surfers are packing their board bags that way?
That's always a good question. This is a venue that I'm surprised that most people don't try to even look at the left, Dave. I don't know if it's just me being a goofy or whatnot.
It's just you and me watching the broadcast being like, there's another one. That's on left. There's another one. There's another one.
I've seen so many clips of events, 90s, 2000s, where the left was scored well. And I see 95% of the people in the comp only go right. And I'm just tripping to myself the whole time because I saw Iago do a sick air on the left there during one of the heats a few years ago. And he got a counting score. And I was like, why wouldn't more people try to open up and diversify their surfing by presenting something different on a wave that normally isn't surfed in the comp? I feel like more people should go left. It's very swell dependent, obviously, there too. The right tends to stand up more, but it's a real short wave. And unless you're getting something critical on the outside, the inside ain't really counting that much. So in terms of equipment, I feel like the box and Margaret River, you're usually going to ride something very similar, unless once it gets above 6 feet, then you're riding something a little bit longer. In terms of the models, though, Mayhem, you're probably riding your Driver 3.0, something that really wants a high-performance wave. 77, I would think, would work good there. That's Felipe's model or one of them from Sharp Eye. And I think if you're one of TNC surfers, Sally or Brisa, this is a wave that really suits your style and the equipment that you're riding, because it's something that really resembles where you're going to see over in the Hawaiian Islands. I think that's why both Tyler Wright and John Florence have had major success there with Paizel, too, because it's a wave that really suits the boards that they're bringing over to West Oz.
That's a great point. Well, we'll look forward to the Western Australia Margaret River Pro, which is starting in just a few days after this airs. So get your fantasy teams ready. We're going to take another quick break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come back, we will finish up.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Lineup Podcast. That's Dave Prodan. I'm Mitchell Salazar, your part-time co-host here at the world's greatest surfing podcast. And as always, if we don't get to your question today, you can always write us at the Lineup Pod, and we'll do our best to respond in our DMs as we always do. But most importantly, Dave, it's our favorite segment, talking to our fans and to our listeners, the people that really fuel the fire for the pod. Let's get into it. Our first one at August 2602. Did Medina was right about the judges? I'm pretty sure he's asking, was he right about the judging over there at Bell's? What do you got, Dave?
Right. Okay. Good. Let's start with the heater. But yeah, so we mentioned it already, right? So Cole Houshmand beat Gabriel Medina, last minute wave. I watched the heat and then rewatched it on the Heat Analyzer. I am not a judge, and I think it's important to reiterate, because we brought this up on the podcast before. The broadcast does an awesome job covering the sport. We get all these different angles. We get close-ups. We get slow-mo. It's really, really good. But we have to stress that it's not the live angle. It's not the angle the surfers are surfing at. It's not the angle the judges are judging at. So there is a little bit of separation between what we're watching on broadcast versus what we're seeing, versus what people are seeing live. That said, even watching it on the broadcast, I personally felt like Cole got the score he needed on the final wave. And And we talked about before, right? Everyone's echo chambers are unique and they're subjective. And mine was about 50-50. You know, half the people thought Medina should have won the heat based on the strength of his scoring rides. The other half felt like Cole had it. So again, it's subjective. Everyone has their own opinion about it. I think it's interesting, and this is back-to-back years, and as we talked about before we recorded, at the same exact venue where a world champion, last year it was Felipe Toledo against Jackson Baker, and this year it was Gabriel Medina versus Cole Houshmand, have gotten onto the steps moments after the heat was finished and said the score was wrong, not having watched the wave, not having watched the heat, not having really taken time to do it. So, hey, you know what? Like, it is great for team content, but at the same time, I don't know if it reflects that great on the surfer to be like, that surfer definitely didn't get the score. And I know. And it's like, but you didn't watch it. So I don't know. I feel like if I had to kind of go back to that echo chamber piece, since it's happened, it feels like even more people feel like Cole won the heat. Now that might be a recency bias because he kept ripping all the way to ringing the bell. But yeah, I think Medina got that one wrong about the judges. I don't think the sport's perfect. I don't think the officials are perfect. I don't think any of us are. But I don't think he was right about that result, personally speaking, if I have to answer the question. What about you, Mitch? What did you think?
You know, I called it. We're doing the Spanish broadcast now, and I had the chance to work the event too. And I called the heat. Watching it live, I just felt like the first combo that Cole did on that wave was a massive point of difference than anything that we had seen in the heat. I know Gabe said during his post-heat interview, and I want to clarify that I thought Gabe's opinion on the matter was not only super respectful, but I thought that he voiced his opinion perfectly. And, given that he is in a little bit of a struggle in terms of consistency of results and maybe not getting his first victory, but we all know he's usually been a slow starter in his whole career. So it's not necessarily a surprise. We're going into an event where he won last year for the first time in Margaret River, but I'm 50-50 too, and in the judge's defense, as you said, that's not necessarily the angle that they're seeing the whole time, and it's usually your first opinion that's the one that you're going to write as your score anyway. So you can watch replay as many times as you want, but front angle, anything in the moment, especially in the end of the heat, in the heat of moment, if it's a wave that catches your eye and you feel like the other surfer already surfed to the score, you're usually going to give it to them. So I feel it's just one of those occasions where Gabe had to control the heat. He could have, and I'm just speculating here, he could have kept Cole off of that wave.
Right.
And we're in a sport, just like any other combat sport, any sport where there's subjectivity involved. There's a criteria, yes, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that things are going to be perfect. And I need to make it very clear here. Not only is this a sport where there's a human factor involved, but most importantly, unless you're making things super clear and leaving no doubt, there will always be something surrounding it where people will have a difference of opinions in the result. We've seen that before. I don't necessarily think that there's anything bad going on behind the scenes, which I think is really important to address, because on social media, the day of and the day after, it's pretty crazy. And I'm just here talking in defense of the judges and the surfers. It's not Cole's fault. It's not the judges' fault. If you have the opportunity to leave no doubt, you need to go ahead and do that. Remember, we're talking about a world championship on the line at the end of the year, too. So this is a result that easily could have been in his top 5 in the first half of the year, and most importantly, a counting result for the world championship, too, and your seeding for the finals.
Well, we've been talking about this for a while, too. Like, I think for both of us, and it's not just because we're goofy footers, but we truly believe that Gabe is one of, if not the best surfer on the planet.
Yes.
And since he took his year off, so this would have been, we saw him come back end of 2022. He wins the Challenger Series event in Saquarema. And all kind of the back end of 2022, I think we were watching him social media. He looked like goddamn Ivan Drago. Like he was like training. I've never seen someone this strong on tour, like ever. Like he looks, and to this day, and he's been doing it ever since, he looks so strong.
Yes.
And you combine that with the talent and the pedigree and the experience and the achievements and the mental game. And I think we're like, who is going to beat this person ever? And the results haven't been there for him, right? And this year in particular, I think you can see the frustration boil over. You mentioned it perfectly. I don't know if his opinion on the Heat has changed since he's watched it a few times. I kind of doubt it. But you can imagine in the moment, you've ripped, you're beating this rookie, you have priority, the clock is ticking down.
Yeah.
You let him have a wave where you go, he's not getting the score. And then he gets the score. And as we said, not only are things not going his way this year, he's like 20th on the rankings. He is at risk of being relegated.
Yeah.
Things are going to boil over. And I think that's for someone like him, as we said, like he should be unbeatable. Now it's surfing, anything can happen. I hope he rebounds in WA. He's an incredible dude. I desperately want to see him in the mix come the end of the year for the world title.
Well, and I think he's important to surfing too. I mean, not just because of the success that he's had, the doors that he's opened. We're talking about the first Brazilian shortboarding champion, which is huge given the great surfers that we had before him and the surfers that we have right now too. And to include him on the list of maybe outside of Kelly Slater, the greatest competitive surfer ever. I mean, I definitely put him up there. And I think the most important part about Gabe too is that his personality has always been very crucial to the championship tour. I mean, inside the water, outside of it, he's been a character. And just like Andy Irons was in his day, I can almost guarantee that Gabe Medina has had the same kind of impact in the culture of surfing. So really want to see him do well at Margaret River. He's the defending champ over there, and hopefully he can bounce back. But as both Dave and I said, we're not controlling the Heat. In the end, it's the 5 people that are up there scoring the 2 surfers in the water. And they had Cole Houshmand unanimously, by the way, defeating Gabriel Medina in that one. So we will try to see him bounce back. And congratulations to Cole Houshmand. He gets his first victory on the Championship Tour. So our second question is from a listener who is one of my personal best friends from where I'm from originally, Mazatlan, Mexico. And at PepeFer3 writes to us, Dave, is this the end of the Florence Medina era? We kind of answered a good portion of it in our last question, but you can go ahead and answer what you think about this.
It's interesting, right? So both of them made it onto the tour at the mid-season rotation. This is before the field was reduced. It was after the field was reduced, excuse me, in 2011.
Yeah.
This is before the 3-tier system, it's before the finals, all that stuff. So they've been on tour the exact same amount of time. This is their 14th year. And I think when they both qualified, it's hard to think this now given what they've achieved, no one had really picked them as world title contenders. And that's just the truth. Mm-hmm. You know, like Gabe had this meteoric rise. He was so young, but it happened so fast. And even then, there'd never been a Brazilian world champion. I think most people in the surfing world were like, yeah, maybe he'll win an event here or there, but he's so young, he's not complete, etc. He immediately delivers on the CT. He wins, 2 out of his first 5 events or whatever it was. And even John, and this is insane to say, but when he qualified, he was kind of known as a barrel guy and kind of an air guy, but mostly just a barrel guy. And I think people are like, well, I hope he can compete in waves that don't provide canvases for that kind of surfing. And they both got better very quickly. That said, I don't know if there's ever been a Florence Medina era where it's lined up perfectly. Like Gabe wins the world title in 2014. John comes in 2016, 2017. Gabe comes back, but they were never really kind of head-to-heading at the same time. And they've never been in a finals together, and whether that's, post world title hangover or injury or whatever, it's just never really lined up. Mm-hmm. So I certainly wouldn't say the Medina Florence era is over. I think they're both surfing better than they ever have. I just think the results haven't lined up to where we're seeing this head to head. I think that's honestly, in speaking to both of them in private over the last few years, they haven't name checked each other, but that's why they love the idea of the finals is like, I might meet someone like that when everything is on the line, and I want to see what I'm made out of, I hope we get it. Like, I hope they end up in the finals this year or in future years, because I think over the last decade, they've certainly stood out as two of the best. I just don't think it's ever lined up at the same time. But I don't know, Mitch, what do you think?
I think you hit it spot on right there. Outside, once again, Kelly, Mark Richards, Tom Curran, Steph Carissa, Gabe and John are two of the greatest surfers of all time and two of the most complete surfers of all time, too. Like, that's the main thing right there. Because Kelly, Andy had that. They could surf 50-foot waves, they could surf 2-foot waves, and be the best in the world still. And you look at Gabe, you look at John, they can almost do the same thing too. And they come from a generation that's incredible. I don't necessarily think it's over. I just think more people are starting to succeed. And I think that's great for the sport too. You need more people, you need more diversity, and most importantly, it's boring if those people at the top aren't being challenged, you know? Like, how many years were there where Kelly, he was winning 6 out of the 7 events? Like, I remember 2008, 4 out of the first 5 events he won. It's like at that point, nobody's going to be able to catch him in terms of the rankings. Like, he had already won the world championship in the first 7 or 8 events mathematically just by his results. So I don't necessarily think it's coming to an end. I just think other people are getting better. And I think that's super necessary and important for the sport.
Yeah, and that ties in with what we talked about earlier about these rookies or these tour sophomores, these young surfers coming on tour and being so prepared. Whereas, in past decades, your top seeds surf against your bottom seeds at the start of the event. And a lot of times they would just mop the floor with them based on experience or inexperience on the younger surfer side. That's not happening anymore. So you're seeing like the Gabe cold heat's a perfect example of, 20 years ago, someone of Gabe's stature facing a rookie of Cole's stature, the rookie probably struggles in those conditions or in that moment with those stakes on the line, and the veteran wins. That's just not the case anymore for any of them. So it's a great point you make.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to see these generational rookies not only gain momentum, but open the door for other people to kind of get inspired and do the same thing too. You mentioned George Pitar as one of your winners for the event. Well, he's on the Challengers again. He could easily qualify for the Championship Tour. He was number 19, 9 spots away. And I think in the end, you need those kind of people to not only create those rivalries, but also make things competitive. Because in the end, what's the point of having a World Championship Tour with a multitude of people if only one person's winning the whole time? It serves no purpose whatsoever. So I think the most important thing, getting more people on the Championship Tour from different regions and have them really compete and make things difficult for the people that have been at the top for years. Great question.
What's the Sonny and I'm going to date myself here. The Sonny and Cher song, the beat goes on, man. The CT goes on. There's just a new cast of characters that come through every so often. So it's exciting to see that in 2024.
And it happens in every sport too. Yeah. Like it just needs to happen. And that's why what Kelly's done for 35 plus years is even more impressive now.
It's amazing.
How many generations did he have to go through, and he's still relevant as a thing. You get him in good waves, like if he's the wild card in Fiji and it's pumping, I'd be a little preoccupied about getting Kelly, especially if he's a wild card and you're one of the top dogs. You're going to have to surf against him in the early rounds.
Yep, I'm with you.
So B.5, not necessarily a question. This is from @BetaMedi. Just wants to say thank you. Really enjoys every episode of the reviews of the CT SOPs that we do. So @BetaMedi, shout out to you. Thanks for listening into the pod.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks to everyone who listens as well. And as we've said, everyone that writes in at the Lineup Pod, if we don't get to your question on the podcast, we do our best to respond to everybody in the DMs anyway. So, that's nice. It's nice to get positive feedback.
And send in the things even if they're negative too. I mean, who cares? Dave and I still read it. We might not be super happy about it, but you can still write to us.
Yeah, for anyone out there who has a little bit of apprehension sending something negative in, don't worry. There are plenty of people who don't have that anxiety, and we still appreciate it. So send it on through.
Yeah, for real. Our final question in the listener question segment, @Santo.Ricardo. Is Cole a Final 5 contender? Now, I can tell you one thing for damn sure, Dave, having competed against him, having judged him, and having surfed lowers with him, he can surf lowers left pretty damn good, and we all know what he can do on his backhand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Like you brought it up a few times, and it's the point of difference thing, which has always been the case in really any sport, but certainly in subjectively scored sports like surfing. It's always been the case. Like if you come in and you're competing and performing at an elite level, but you're also doing it in a way that's a few degrees different in whatever fashion, there is a huge advantage. And that could be technique, it could be equipment. And I think in Cole's case, it's probably a combination, but physicality.
Yeah.
Like he is a big dude and he does big turns, and they're not lumbering turns. They're sharp and with power, both backhand and forehand. He can release the fins. He can get barreled. And, you know, I don't know if we talked about it, but in Hawaii this year, I was the first time. I was not the first time I met Cole, but first time we actually spent some time talking together. He was on the podcast. I hung out a bit in person, and at Surfers Orientation, none other than former world number 2 and goofy foot icon Luke Egan was there, and I've known Luke for a number of years, and he and I were talking, and I said, "Oh, so good to catch up," he was coaching Caroline Marks last year, coached her to a world title. And I said, "Oh, you're back with Caroline this year?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm also coaching Cole Houshmand." I said, "Oh, that's cool. How did you guys connect?" He goes, "I reached out to him." And I went, "Holy crap, man, that must feel like winning the world title already. Like if Luke Egan's reaching out to coach you,
Yeah.
that's impressive." So Luke sees something in Cole. I think we all see something in Cole. And I think, as we said, it's the point of difference, and also the fact that every surfer, men's and women's CT, they can win, you know? And so I think he's a Final 5 contender. I think he's a world title contender. What about you, Mitch?
Yeah, I think so too. And we had a panel last year that you led at the U.S. Open, which I thought was really, really necessary because we had all the brands there, everybody representing the brand too. And we brought up Cole Houshmand and how at that point of the Challenger season, he had already qualified for the Championship Tour. He actually ended up winning the Challenger Series within the first 4 events of the season. We still had 2 events to go, which were both Portugal and Brazil. And at that point, I told you my personal perspective was that he was going to be Rookie of the Year, and he was going to compete for the World Championship. So as of right now, has his first Championship Tour victory, is within the top 10. It's not guaranteed that he's going to stay both within the top 10 and make it into the Final 5, but confidence is a major thing. And getting into rhythm with both your equipment, the ocean, the location, and as you said, having Luke Egan in his corner, who's won a CT event at Lowers, by the way, is something major. And especially when somebody like his, with his degree, his pedigree, has really gone through the kind of multitudes of difficulties that a lot of goofy footers had to endure for years in the 90s, 2000s, where there are minimal lefts on the Championship Tour. This guy knows what Cole's both capable of doing and what he has to go through in order to be successful. So to be able to do it with the format that we have now at Lowers, even if you're number 1, you're number 5, there's a possibility of winning a world championship, and it just comes down to preparation. During the offseason, you saw it with the incredible production that our broadcast has. Physically, he looks fit. It looks like his boards and his equipment's in tune. I truly feel that he's a top 10 surfer, and you better watch out because having Fiji as the last event of the year, an event that he could easily win, that is a major possibility for him making it into the top 5 and being a world champion in his rookie season. Would be the first male to do so as well, outside of Stephanie Gilmore being the only female.
I think that's really well said. Thanks to everyone who wrote in questions at the lineup pod. As we said, if we didn't get to your question on the pod, we'll do our best to respond in the DMs there. So thanks again. Keep the questions and comments coming. Mitch, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And we're going to talk again real soon when CT5, the Western Australia Margaret River Pro, wraps. Everyone can watch that live on worldsurfleague.com and the WSL app. Thanks again, Mitch.
And make sure to go left, Goofies. Come on, let's see the left bank over there in Margaret River.